Welcome back. This is the next video in our series, How to Build an API with Node.js. If you have not watched the previous video, I highly recommend that you go back and watch it. I will link it on the screen. Each video builds upon the previous one. Welcome back. Last time, we implemented Swagger to give us a UI for making calls to our API and to see what information the routes may be expecting. However, this was purely for documentation purposes and won't prevent unexpected or bad data from being sent to the routes. That's where JOI comes in. JOI is an NPM package that provides a readable and modular way to validate input before it can cause problems. We'll be adding JOI to our API to make it more secure, and I encourage you to check out the documentation at joi.dev/API for more details. To get started, we need to install the JOI npm package. So let's open our terminal and we'll type npm I JOI, and this will install the latest version of the package. And now that we have that installed, we're ready to start implementing. JOI allows us to create schema against which data is tested. Using various data identifiers and rules, we can make sure only data we expect or need is making it through. So what we need to do now is define our validation schema. So let's start by creating a new folder in our project called validation, and this will hold our validation schema. So we will create a new file within this folder called validation.js. If you'll recall, we have 4 routes: a get, a post, a put, and a delete. If we go back to our routes in our to-do-list.js, we can see that the get route doesn't actually take in any information. So we don't need to worry about implementing JOI for this. So we'll start out with our post route, and we can see here that it is expecting a body that has an entries array that has objects with the keys title and due date. So let's head back to our validation.js file and begin the implementation. So first we'll use strict, and we need to import the JOI package. So const JOI equals require JOI. This will be a module that we will export. So module.exports equals an object, and our we're going to call our first schema create entries, because that's what the post route is doing. So create entries, and we will access the JOI package with the object type, and in it we will build our object that we are expecting. So the object here is the body, and on the body we are expecting an entries property, and this is an array, so JOI.array, and the items that it is expecting .items. Within the parens we are going to specify what the objects look like. So we'll need to use JOI.object again, and I'm going to move this to the next line for readability. And again, within it, we need to create an object. So each object is expecting a title, and this will be a string, so JOI.string, and we'll say that the title is required in order to create an entry. Next, the due date, which is expected. In our case, we are also expecting a string, if you recall, it matches the shape date at time. So for that, we are going to specify that it has to match a specific pattern. And since we will be using this regular expression, so this pattern specifies that whatever regular expression is within the parens should be used to test the string value that has been received. So we are going to create our regular expression. So due date regular expression equals we start out with a with our month. So this is the beginning of the string, a digit character, so a number character, and then with a length of 2, so it's expecting 2 numbers, and then a /. So this first backslash is a escaping character, and then another 2 digits, and then another /, and then a 4-digit, which represents the year. And then with a space, at space, and then our time, which is 2 digits, followed by a colon and another 2 digits. And finally, the string ends in either AM or PM, and then after that there are no more characters. So we want our due date value to match this. So we come into our pattern parens and we specify to use the due date regular expression to test. And then finally we're going to make this a required property as well. And that takes care of the post route schema. Now, the point of these schema is to actually test the object or data that we are given. So in order to do that, we are going to first create a utility function that can be reused and keep our code a little bit cleaner. So we're going to come over here, we're going to create a _utils.js file at the root level of our project. We'll use strict, and for this we will export our validation function. So the purpose of this function is to keep our code dry, so don't repeat yourself. And this function will take in a schema against which we will test our given object, and then the object that we want to validate. So we need to store the result from our validation. So const validation equals, and then the way that we use our JOI schema is schema dot validate, and then we pass it the object to validate. And for our purposes, we are going to add a configuration object to the validation method, validate method, and we are going to specify abort early as false. So what this configuration does is it prevents the schema from saying, hey, I encountered one bad piece, so I'm done checking, and here's what the bad data piece was. So we want our routes to return all instances of bad data. So if title and due date are bad, we want the user to know so that they can update without having to make two different calls. One to find out that title is bad, and then another to find out that due date is bad. Next, if validation.hasOwnProperty of error, so this means that an error was encountered, we want to throw an error. So just like with our routes, so for instance up here we have in our get route we have if todolist.entries.length is 0, then we just throw an error with a status of 404 and message no entries found. So that enters our error handler that is specified in our server.js file, and then our user is given a helpful message stating that they have encountered an error. So we come back to our utils. So first we need to gather the message from the validation object. So validation.error.details, and this is an array, so we're going to map it at D, and we are going to return the message from each detail object, and then we are going to convert this to a string. So this is one long string that has each of the failure messages within it. And finally, we are going to throw an object with a status of 400, meaning bad request, and a message. Now that we have our JOI schema written and we have our validate utility function, let's use it in our route. So we're going to go back to todolist.js, down to our post route. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to come up here and we're going to import our schema and our validate utility function. So first, we're going to import the validate function. So import const validate equals require and reference our utils file. And if you haven't seen this before, this is object destructuring. So what is returned from this import is this object, and we are just saying, hey, from this object I want to specifically pull out the validate property. So we have that, and now we are going to import our create entries schema from our validation file. So require / validation.js. Then we go down to our post route, and in order to use this, all we have to do is call our validate with the schema that we want to use, so create entries, and our object to validate, so rec.body. So now this is going to verify that we have a valid title and a valid due date entry on each of the entries in our to-do list entries. In our rec.body.entries. Let's pull this up in Swagger, and I will show you what it looks like when there is a failure and when it succeeds. So back in our in our terminal, we're going to run npm start. Npm start to get our server running. And then we'll go over to Swagger. So we've got our Swagger open. Remember, it's localhost 3001 API-docs. And then we come down to our post, try it out, and let's do an invalid body to start out with. So we have our request.body, it is empty. If we hit execute, okay, so the reason why this is happening is because we actually forgot to tell our schema that our body is required to have an entries array. So we're going to head back over to our code, and we're going to actually set .required at the end of this entries array.items, so .required, and then same thing for the create entries. So we want to make sure that our body actually exists as well. So now if we head back over to our Swagger and we run this, we should see that it'll say entries is required. So hit enter. Yep. Now we have our status 404 or 400 with our message entries is required. So I'm gonna hit reset so that we have this again. So now in our entries, if I remove this piece, so it's an empty array, I believe, let's see. Alright, so no entries are created. So let's go back over to our code, and we're going to specify that our entries array must have at least a length of 1. So back in our code, for our items, we want to specify here, just before the .required at the end of our entries entry schema, we want to specify min of 1. So what this is going to do is it's going to say, hey, this entries array must have at least a length of 1, so at least one object in it. And let's head back over to our Swagger. And now if we hit execute, we should see, yep, entries must contain at least one item. So, lastly, let's see what happens when we have multiple entries. So we'll do 3 entries. We will have one without a due date, one with without a title, and we'll have one that is completely valid. So title, we'll say date with wife, and we'll say 8/20/2022 at 7 p.m. Alright, so now if I hit execute, we should see, we'll have to actually remove that for valid JSON. So we should see that there is no error for the first entry. We should see that there's an error for the second entry saying that due date is missing. And we should see an error for the third entry saying that title is missing, and that due date is formatted incorrectly. So now if we hit execute, and we come down here, Here we are. So yes, we see, oh, you know what? Okay, so I made my regular expression a little strict, so it needs leading zeros for here, for the month. But you can see here, so due date in the first entry is invalid. It doesn't match this regular expression. Entries, the second entry has no due date, so it's saying due date is required. And then the third entry has no title, so title is required. And the third entry also, the due date, fails to match the regular expression. So you can see how JOI actually prevents bad data from coming in. So now if I remove these and then... sorry about that, my dog was barking. So if we update our due date to be valid, so we add that leading zero, then we hit execute, then we see here our date with wife to-do list entry was added. And again, if we go to our get and we run it, we see that it is actually in the to-do list entries array. Now that we have our post route validated, let's go implement the put and delete route validation. So back in our code, let's take a look at what our put route is expecting. So we come back to our to-do list.js, scroll down, and our put body is expecting a data object with properties title and due date. But note that they are not both required. So we want to allow the user to update only the title or only the due date, or update both at the same time. So we're going to have to add special handling for that. So let's go back to our validation.js, and we will create a new method or schema called update entry. So this will be for the put. Be a JOI object that has an ID. So even though we are not taking the ID in the body, we will be adding our ID to it in order to validate that it is a number and it is greater than 1. So we come back to our validation. So we have ID. It will be a JOI number, and we are expecting an integer specifically, and this integer has to have a minimum value of 1, and this will be a required property. Next, our put is expecting a data object, so JOI.object, and this has a title, JOI string, and we are marking it optional. It does this by default, but it can be helpful to explicitly state that this is optional. And a due date that is a JOI.string, and it has to match the pattern as shown above for the post, due date regular expression, and this is optional as well. So, as I stated, the user is allowed to send one or the other, or both at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this OR method on the data object. And what this says is the comma separated strings within this set of parentheses, you have to have at least one of these in the object, but you can have more, and you don't have to have all of them. So you can have just the title or just the due date, but you have to have at least one of them present in the object. And we are going to make this object required. Oh, there we go. And finally, we are going to make the body object itself required. So let's go back to our to-do list, and once again we are going to instead of setting the ID here, we are going to add it to the body. rec.body.id equals %, and then validate update entry, and we will auto import that, and pass in rec.body. So now for this, we need to update this to be rec.body.id, and that should be it for the put route. So let's head back over to Swagger to make sure that this is working as expected. So we're back in Swagger, and currently we're in the get. Let's collapse those. Now, actually, since the server restarted, let's make sure that the array has an actual entry. So we'll execute this on the post. So now we have 1. So let's come in here. We will use the 1, and we will set. Let's update the title. Well, yeah. Sorry, let's update the due date. So let's update it to 08/15/2022 at 7 p.m. instead of what was it, like 8:20? Yeah. All right, then we'll hit execute. So it worked correctly. It's now 8/15/2022. Now let's try sending an empty data object, and you'll see data must contain at least one of title or due date. And if we do title, so date with wife evening, let's say, and title, execute, you can see that it now says date with wife evening. Lastly, let's double check that the ID is working correctly. So we'll say NaN right here, execute, and actually in this case it won't work because Swagger is performing some type checking. Integer, so NaN is not an integer, obviously, but yeah, that takes care of the put route. Lastly, let's head back over to our code and implement the delete schema. So we come back to our our delete, and we see that it only takes in a ID in the path. So this one will be very simple. We will head back over to our validation.js. We'll add a new entry, which will be delete entry JOI object, and this will be just an ID, which is a number, and it will be an integer, and it will have a min value of 1, and it's required. And this will be .required. So once again, pretty simple. We'll come back over to our to-do list. ref.js, and we will validate against delete entry, and we'll pass in rec.params. So the params object functions similarly to the body in that it is an object with some key value pairs. In this case, it is the ID only. So we just pass in delete entry and rec.params, and that is it for this route. We won't actually be able to test this one in Swagger for the same reason that we couldn't test the ID in the put route, because Swagger recognizes that our value is not a number and tells us, doesn't let us actually make the call. But that actually reminds me, we could pass 0. So we are expecting a minimum value of 1. So let's go throw in a 0, since that is a integer according to Swagger and everybody else, I guess. And let's see what happens. So we come down to our delete, and let's try it out. We'll pass in a 0 for ID and hit execute, and here we go. Error 400, ID must be greater than or equal to 1. So it works. Perfect. And with that, our JOI implementation is done. If you found this helpful or interesting, please remember to leave a like and subscribe. It helps more than you may realize. Let me know in the comments what you would like to see in future videos, and have a wonderful day.